Welcome to the Clinical File. I'm John Cordray, and I'm a licensed professional counselor, and this is my mental health analysis of the Nicola Maduro case. I'll be focusing on the main mental health and psychological indicators while providing the backstory. I don't just talk about the crimes, I talk about the psychology behind the crimes and the mysteries that captivate us. I look beyond the facts of the case to understand the why of the crime. My analysis is based on my speculations. It's not a diagnosis of anyone involved in this case. What causes a man who grew up in a middle-class home to slowly morph into a figure accused of leading a global narco-terrorism conspiracy? Is it possible for a person to lose their original identity entirely and become a mere vessel for a dead mentor's ideology? When we look at the early life of Nicolas Maduro, we see a young man who was surprisingly quiet and conciliatory. He grew up in a working-class neighborhood and was born on November 23, 1962. His father was a union leader, which provided an early blueprint for power through group organization rather than individual brilliance. One of the first psychological red flags is the absence of a cohesive personal narrative. Observers and former classmates describe a young Maduro who did not speak much and wasn't known for agitating crowds. In mental health, we sometimes see this as a lack of a strong ego development. If a child does not develop a distinct sense of self, they may later overcompensate by attaching themselves to a high-status leader or a rigid ideology. This brings us to our first question. How can a person's lack of a clear childhood identity make them more susceptible to becoming a ruthless enforcer for someone else? As we watch his trajectory, the promise of this analysis is to uncover how this blank slate personality allowed him to rise through the ranks of the Venezuelan government until he became the handpicked successor of Hugo Chavez. We'll explore how this lack of internal identity might have led to the creation of a simulacrum leader. This is a person who represents whatever the power structure needs him to be at any given moment. The case reached a breaking point on January 3, 2026, when Maduro and his wife Celia were captured in a U.S.-led military operation. This was not just a political shift, but a psychological collapse of a regime that had lasted over a decade. Maduro was flown to New York City and held at a detention center in Brooklyn. He pleaded not guilty to 4 counts: narco-terrorism conspiracy, cocaine importation, and weapons charges. To understand how a former bus driver ended up in a federal court in Manhattan, we have to look at the psychological concept of authoritarian submission. Maduro's early years as a bus driver weren't just a job. They were a strategic move by his political party. He didn't just drive. He organized unions and became a surrogate for the mentor's whims. This leads us to a second red flag. Why would an individual prioritize absolute loyalty to a superior over their own moral or professional boundaries? In many cases of authoritarian behavior, we see a deep-seated need for external validation from a father figure. For Maduro, Hugo Chavez was that figure. When Chavez was dying in 2013, he chose Maduro not for his charisma, but for his predictability and loyalty. From a mental health perspective, this loyalty can sometimes mask a profound fear of personal autonomy. If you are the vessel for another man's revolution, you don't have to take responsibility for your own choices. This brings us to a crucial psychological question. Does a leader who believes they are carrying out a legacy feel less guilt for the suffering of their people? When Maduro took power, the world saw a shift from the charismatic populism of Chavez to a more rigid defensive style of rule. He faced a narrow election in 2013 and eventually a massive economic collapse. Instead of adapting, he doubled down on repression. The indictment claims he used the Venezuelan state apparatus to ship 250 tons of cocaine annually. This suggests a psychological trait called projectivity. Dictators often project their own internal chaos and perceived threats onto the outside world. They see enemies everywhere, which justifies their own aggressive or criminal behavior. If you believe the entire world is trying to destroy you, then any action, even drug trafficking or state sponsorship violence, becomes a form of self-defense in your mind. But what happens when the self you are defending is actually a persona you've built to please a dead mentor? This is a red flag often seen in people who occupy high-pressure roles they aren't naturally suited for. It creates a permanent simulacrum where the person says whatever is necessary to survive the hour. He could offer peace negotiations one day and then order an Operation Knock Knock the next. This operation involved mass arrests of descendants without legal orders, creating a culture of fear. Is a leader's sudden shift between kindness and extreme cruelty a sign of a fragmented personality? By the time 2024 arrived, the psychological walls were closing in. The July 2024 elections were widely seen as fraudulent, with opposition candidate Edmundo likely winning the majority of votes. Despite this, Maduro claimed victory and began a third term on January 10, 2025. The psychological cost of maintaining a lie of that magnitude is immense. It requires a complete detachment from reality, a state where the leader's internal world is the only one that matters. This leads us to our fourth red flag, the inability to process objective truth when it contradicts the leader's desired narrative. When a person reaches this level of power, they often suffer from hubris syndrome. This is characterized by a loss of contact with reality and a belief that they are the only one accountable to history or God rather than their peers or the law. The 2026 capture of Maduro was the ultimate test of this psychological state. Imagine the shock to a man who has spent years in a bubble in his country when he is suddenly arrested by a foreign military. Reports indicate he and his wife were caught during an early morning raid. The sudden loss of control can lead to a psychological shattering. At his arraignment on January 5, 2026, Maduro was described in the courtroom sketches as appearing with his wife and defense attorneys. The man who once stood on stages, defiant and loud, was now subject to the rigid protocols of the U.S. federal court. This brings up another behavioral indicator. How does an authoritarian personality react when they are no longer the one holding the gavel? Often we see a shift back to the conciliatory or victim persona. Maduro claimed his capture was proof of the U.S. aggression, attempting to maintain his narrative of being a martyr for his country. This is a classic defensive mechanism used to avoid the psychological pain of admitting personal failure or criminal culpability. By framing himself as the victim, he avoids the moment of realizing the impact of his actions on millions of Venezuelans. The 2020 indictment, which was unsealed and updated in early 2026, alleges that he ordered kidnappings and murders of those who undermine his drug operations. This level of alleged violence suggests a lack of empathy that is often associated with the dark triad of personality traits. If these allegations are true, we are looking at a man who viewed human lives as mere obstacles to his financial or political goals. This leads us to a chilling question. Can a person's desire for power completely erase their capacity for human empathy? The mental health analysis of a dictator often points to a competitive worldview. This is a belief that the world is a dangerous zero-sum game. If you aren't a predator, you are the prey. For Maduro, the transition from a student leader to a bus driver to a president might have reinforced his survival of the fittest mentality. In the world of union politics and revolutionary struggle, weakness is often punished. So the psychological response is to become tough-minded and cynical. This cynicism allows a person to rationalize participating in narco-terrorism conspiracy. They tell themselves, everyone is corrupt, I'm just more successful at it. This is a psychological red flag known as moral disengagement. It's how people can commit or oversee horrific acts while still believing they are good people. Another red flag we see is an authoritarian aggression. This is the tendency to be hostile to anyone who violates the group's norms or challenges the leader's authority. Under Maduro, the number of political prisoners in Venezuela increased by over 700% in just 1 year. This isn't just political strategy. It is a psychological compulsion to eliminate any source of cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is a mental discomfort we feel when our beliefs are challenged. For a dictator, a protester isn't just a citizen with a different opinion. They are a direct threat to the leader's psychological stability. By silencing the dissenter, the leader restores their internal sense of being right and powerful. But this stability is a house of cards. As the economic crisis in Venezuela deepened, with millions struggling for basic goods, Maduro's response became more erratic. He would claim the crisis was an economic war waged by outsiders. This externalization of blame is a key indicator of a person who can't handle personal accountability. Now that he is in a Brooklyn detention center, he is forced into an environment of total accountability. The legal process is slow and methodical, which is the exact opposite of the simulacrum environment he built. His wife Celia is also facing charges, which adds a layer of familiar pressure and betrayal. In psychology, we look at the enabler role in these high-stakes criminal cases. Was she a partner in the alleged crimes, or was she also a victim of the same rigid power structure? The indictment suggests she received bribes and participated in the conspiracy. This creates a shared psychosis where two people reinforce each other's delusional or criminal worldviews. When the two of them appear in court together, we see a remnants of a powerful couple who believed they were untouchable. This brings us to our final psychological question. What happens to a person's mind when the untouchable world they built completely vanishes overnight? The capture of Maduro on January 3, 2026 will likely be studied for years by political psychologists. It represents a total disruption of the authoritarian script. The defense attorneys will likely argue for the head of state immunity, a legal concept. But from a psychological perspective, this is just another way to avoid the reality of the situation. It's an attempt to hide behind a title when the person behind the title is being held responsible for the lives of millions. As the trial approaches, set for March 17, 2026, we will likely see more of his behavior under pressure. Will he remain the loyal surrogate for a dead revolution, or will he finally show a distinct individual personality? The clinical file is about looking beyond the headlines to see the human mind at work, even in the most extreme forms. Maduro's case is a study in what happens when a person's identity is swallowed by power and ideology. It's a story of a quiet young man who allegedly became a central node in a global criminal network. The red flags were there from the beginning: the lack of a personal narrative, the total submission to a mentor, and the eventual projection of all internal problems onto external enemies. These behaviors are not just political tactics. They are the outward signs of a complex psychological journey. Understanding the why of its rise and fall helps us to recognize these patterns in the world around us. The mystery isn't just how he stayed in power for so long, but how he convinced himself that his actions are justified. As we continue to follow the trial in New York, we will look for more clues into his mental state. Was he a true believer, or was he a man who got lost in the role he couldn't quite fill? This is one of those cases that probably, unless you've been following it very closely, you may not know all the details of what's going on or the history of what's going on. You might know a little bit from the headlines, but when we really look at the individual person, we see a man who was transformed by his environment. Things that happened in his past transformed him into be a dictator, and a dictator rules over people and people suffer. This is narcissism at an extreme level. So what did you think about this? Were there any elements that stood out to you? If you want more mental health analysis of true crime stories like this one, be sure to subscribe for more. And if you found this case compelling, be sure to watch this next story. It will make you more aware of your surroundings. Thank you for joining me today. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe.